Hey there, all. Welcome back. This is going to be lecture number 2, and this is chapter 5, right? So, democracy and dictatorship, conceptualization and measurement. So, a lot of this chapter is devoted to sort of let's learn how social science measures are created, and we're going to take a specific focus on democracy versus dictatorship, right? And so, um, there's some really interesting stuff here. The introduction starts with the idea that democracy was highly disrespected until about, basically 1945, 1950. That was a fly. 1945 to 1950, when World War II ended, everybody saw the devastation that Stalinism, communism in Mao Zedong's China, um, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, etc. That had become out of hand, right? That the power that these states had sort of wielded and the violence that they had wielded against their citizens and other citizens of other countries, like we talked about in the former chapter, was starting to get remarkably high because of the technology. And so, the intro to the chapter is just basically a discussion of why democracy over time has been considered sort of a inferior alternative, right, to monarchy or to sort of what would you even call it, aristocracy, maybe. And the concerns were that there would be mob rule, right? That there would be tyranny of the majority, that there would be these massive class warfares, right, that were predicted by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Um, and that sort of the unwashed masses would take power, right? And we even see some of this stuff in some of the most famous philosophers, like Rousseau, who was very for the citizens, um, and even John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and even Thomas Jefferson and others like that. In America, they weren't at all interested in opening up elections to the quote unquote unwashed masses, right? The voting rights were very restricted. You had to be a white male landowner who had built some property upon his land in most states. Um, Senators were not elected by the people. The president, even to this day, is not elected by the people. It is elected by electoral college, right? Delegates who represent the people. So there was a lot of skepticism about democracy and especially how it could possibly be implemented and implemented in a way that was fair and equitable to minority citizens. Um, and the idea that people didn't have enough civics or education to really understand anything about elections, about the arguments that representatives were making, about the direction that the country should go in economically and domestically and internationally. And so there was a lot of skepticism. Okay, so we'll move on to section 1, democracy and dictatorship in historical perspective. And we sort of discussed this in the former chapter, so I'm going to mostly skip over this. And the only real point that I would make here that the book pointed out also is that, um, the democratic system was always sort of, it was seen as tied to class warfare, right? Where the poor would inevitably fight the wealthy. Um, and it was also about sort of mob rule, right? And not until the French Revolution and the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s did we really see this analogy being made between democracy and a fight against aristocracy as democracy as meritocracy, right? That concept, those two concepts, had never really been um, analogized, had never really been synonymous with each other. But with the fight against aristocracy and the fight for freedom against colonialism in America, um, democracy starts to take on this form of anti-elitism and anti-colonialism, right? And so this is one of the things that really starts to push the philosophy of democracy even harder. And then, like I said, the idea that democracy was the best system really solidified and post World War II. All right. Section 2 talks about the classifications of democracies and dictatorships. So we're going to talk about a little bit of theory by especially Robert Dahl, who is maybe the most famous democratic theorist that we've ever known. He wrote his most famous book in 1971, and it was sort of a response to this pair of researchers named Lipset and Rokan, who wrote their books about political cleavages in the 1950s and 1960s. And then Dahl comes out and he says, well, no, it's not about that. It's about institutions, right? It's not about political cleavages. It's not about class warfare or abortion policy or whatever it is in the society or religion or whatever. It's about institutions, right? And he also says that, like, we have to get away from this idea that a state that is doing well, right, is a quote unquote democracy, right? Because that's not really true. Like if we look at a state like, say, Singapore, really, really world crushing technology, awesome universities, some freedoms for their citizens, extraordinarily high GDP per capita, and yet in no way a democracy, right? And so he says we got to get away from this idea that we're looking at output of a society to judge whether it is a democracy or not. And we need to look at their political institutions and take sort of this procedural viewpoint rather than a normative argument, right? Normative means like it's based on your own morality or whatever. You're making this morality argument, a normative argument about, do people have rights and is the society equitable and, all of these things. And Dahl says, no, 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 no. We need to look at, is the society inclusive? Do they have elections? And then is there actual contestation in the society, right? Can they assemble and have free speech? Do they have opposition political parties that are actually legitimate, right? They're not just fake or faux parties. And, are campaigns open and legal? And so he basically says, okay, well, based on this really simple understanding of what a democratic society should look like and what their institution should look like, we're going to use two axes to describe societies, right? On the first one, we have contestation. This is mostly procedural. This is about, can you assemble and organize? Do you have free speech? Is there free media? Can you have a legitimate oppositional political party? And are there free and open campaigns? And then the second axis is inclusion, right? What proportion of your society can vote? And so there's an argument to be made before, say, the 1960s, really, 1965. America was not a democracy. And there are some measurements of democracy out there that does not count America as a democracy until 1965 when we passed the Voting Rights Act. And does not count Switzerland as a democracy until, I believe, they gave women the right to vote in 1968. And so those countries, in a sense, according to Dahl, do not count as full democracies because they're not fully inclusive. They did not allow minorities or women to vote, right? So anyway, that's something to think about, right? So we get basically, when you put these two axes together of contestation and inclusion, you get four boxes, right? And so I'll sort of talk to you about the four boxes, right? We have a high contestation, everybody's sort of allowed free speech and everything, and high inclusion, everyone's allowed to vote. So this is going to be most of Europe, this is going to be North America, Canada, Mexico, etc. High contestation, low inclusion. right? So this is going to be South Africa during apartheid, where yes, they had oppositional parties, but you could only be white. And you could only vote if you were white. So, yes, there is contestation, but not inclusion. And this, I would argue, and so do the authors, is early America, where women couldn't vote. The poor in general couldn't vote because they weren't landowning and they did not own a particularly sized property on land that they may have been squatting on, basically. Women were not allowed to vote. Blacks were not allowed to vote. And so, early America, we do have high contestation because we have different political parties. Everybody's got free speech. They're out there debating all the time. But not everyone's allowed to participate. Okay, then you have low contestation, right? You're not allowed to freely speak, you're not allowed to freely organize, and you also have low inclusion. And so I would point to a country like China, right, where only party members get to vote, basically. You cannot vote on anything above a municipal level. Um, and it's a one party system, right? There is no legitimate opposition. There is the CCP or nothing. And this would also include a country like North Korea, where you cannot speak freely. It is a one-party system. Obviously, the Kim family. It's a god dynasty. Even they tell their citizens they're gods. And so that's another one. And then finally, the final box would be low contestation, right? It's probably a one-party state, or they have really weak oppositional parties. And so Russia would be one. It's getting to the point where you really can't speak out anymore, and so they're becoming a low. I mean, they're probably becoming a low inclusion state too, because they're going to start restricting voting for what it looks like. But as of the moment, they have low contestation, but people are allowed to vote, right? So USSR, Venezuela, today's Russia. I would also sort of, to play devil's advocate, point to countries like Mexico. From 1950 until about 2000, only the Revolutionary Party, man, it's the PRI. I cannot remember exactly what it stands for, but oh yeah, the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party of Mexico. Right, it's a mouthful. But the PRI was the only um, political party that ever won elections in Mexico for a very, very long time. And so, as we'll talk later, Jaworski and the DD Index don't really count them as a democracy um, until they were beaten by Moreno, who is the current party. Um, and then I would also point to a country like Japan, right? Japan, post World War II, had only the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, have power from 1946 to 2005. I mean, so you're talking 60 years. And so the problem there is yes, you can vote, but is there real legitimate political opposition? Jaworski and Shaboob and others would say absolutely not. Those were not democracies. Anyway, interesting argument to be made. And then Dahl actually says, kind of like Rousseau and others, that democracy isn't a real thing, right? That is the sort of shining goal on the hill, but it's not possible in reality, right? And so what we want is a polyarchy, a highly inclusive and highly contested society where everyone gets to speak and everyone gets to vote, and there are actual oppositional parties. And when you lose an election, you give up power to the winning party. Okay, Section 2.2, we will talk about three different measures of democracy or dictatorship. Remember, we sort of talked about it's a spectrum. The first one, however, is not a spectrum. It is what is called a dichotomous variable. It is only a one or a zero, like computer language. It is a binary. And so you either count as a democracy or you do not. And that is the work of Adam Jaworski, Michael Shaboob, Stephen Lemongi, mostly professors from New York University, NYU, which is one of the best political science programs on the earth. And so Jaworski studies democratic transitions and economics and democratic transitions, and then also sort of institutions and economic performance, right? And so his work is just absolutely groundbreaking to this day. But they built this dichotomous measure of democracy as sort of a response to all of these really difficult to understand measures that we'll talk about next. And there are very, very few rules about the DD registry. The data says basically there are four rules you have to pass to be called a democracy. The first, the president or the prime minister or whatever, the executive, has to be an elected position. Second, the legislature has to be elected. Third, there have to be multi-party elections where there's legitimate opposition. So now we're counting out PRI Mexico and LDP Japan. And then fourth, there have to be alternation of power under identical election rules, right? So, we both parties or all six parties or whatever it is vie under the same electoral rules. The winner in the last one steps down when the people say so. And so if you meet those basic four qualifications, you're a democracy. And if you don't, you're not. And so it's a very, very simplified measure of democracy. It's one of my favorite just because it is so easy to understand, where some of these absolutely are not. But anyway, really, really good. Really, really good measurement, and it correlates really well with the other measurements actually that we'll talk about, which is sort of a point for its side given its simplicity. Okay, the second measure is called Polity 4. This is from Marshall, Gurr, and Jaggers. They're from Uppsala University in Sweden. And actually, one of my former professors, Dr. David Lexian, he is not only tenured here at Texas Tech University, but also at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and also at Uppsala University in Sweden. So he sort of rotates, right? And I was very lucky to get to study under him. But Marshall, Gurr, and Jaggers from Uppsala University, they put together their own democracy versus autocracy, and it's actually a sort of mishmash of two variables, right? So you have a democracy score from 0 to 10, and then you have an autocracy score from 0 to 10. And then what you do is you take the democracy score, you subtract the autocracy score, and that's your measure, right? And so a plus 10 is like a perfect democracy, completely open, inclusive, competitive, etc. All these things we've talked about. A minus 10 is like a completely totalitarian state. There is no legitimate opposition, no free speech, no elections, things like that, right? And so most researchers, what they do is they'll take this minus 10 to plus 10 measure and they'll break it into three parts. And so from minus 10 to minus 6 is like an autocracy or a dictatorship or whatever you want to call it. A minus 5 to plus 5 is what they call an anocracy. It's a mixed bag. And then from plus 6 to plus 10 is a democracy, a solid democracy. And so, some researchers push it out to sevens, from minus 10 to 7, and then from plus 7 to plus 10. But, we don't need to get into the intricacies. The vast majority of them use the fives. And so, basically they built this scale using 5 dimensions of what they conceive of as democratic versus autocratic, right? And the first is how competitive is the recruitment of the chief executive, right? Second, how open is recruitment for the chief executive position, right? And these are sort of knocks on countries like America because it's not all that open for the chief executive. You must be hyper rich generally. It's not a position that just anybody can sort of stand up and try to take. Third, constraints on the executive, right? How many checks and balances are there? And this is a growing concern in the Freedom House, in the Polity 4 measure for the United States again, in that it's seemingly every modern president we get takes more and more and more and more power. And the Supreme Court seems to be bending more and more and more toward executive power, while the legislature tends to be completely locked and can't really get anything done. So this is another knock on the American dimension. Uh, we have regulation of political participation, right? Like, is everyone allowed to vote? How easy is it? And then competitiveness of political participation. Are there legitimate oppositional parties? Okay, the third and final, actually, I have one that I wanted to add that the book didn't talk about, but the third one from the book is the Freedom House measure. This is a really famous one. And all of these are available online for free, basically. The Freedom House measures freedom. So it is used as a proxy for democracy. There have been many tests run that say, yes, it does actually correlate with other measurements of democracy, like the Polity 4 and like the DD index. But we've got to be careful about using proxies, right? So anyway, for this to work, you must assume that democracy is synonymous or at least analogous with the word freedom. Okay, there are two dimensions in this. That we have political rights and we have civil rights. We'll talk about political rights first. Um, what they do is they go to experts from every country, and they also run surveys, and they ask, you know, on your political rights, how open and fair are your elections? How pluralistic is the participation in your society? Is everyone allowed to vote? And how well does your government function, actually, which is an interesting addition. And so some examples of like the questions that are in here, right? We have, do you have fair elections? How corrupt is your government? How transparent and open are government processes and government spending? How transparent are election results? Is there freedom of association and organization in your state? Are opposition parties actually competitive, and can they exist, of course? And do minorities have autonomy, right? Are they completely controlled by the tyranny of the majority, or do they have general autonomy in their lives? Okay, and then we move to the civil rights. And so this is based on four different dimensions. We have freedom of expression and sort of religious belief, right? Freedom of organization and association, the rule of law in your society, like how strong is your judiciary, and then personal autonomy and individual rights. And so we have some examples here. How free is your media? And are journalists being censored? How free are your religious organizations? And is the state severed from religion? How independent are your courts, and how well do they operate? And then finally, is there equality under the law, or are some people treated differently under the law than others? And so they create an index. They take all of these. It's like 80 questions, which brings up serious problems, right? But it's like 80 questions that they squish into this one measure that ranges from a 1 to a 7. The lower your number, the more democratic you are. The higher you are, the more likely you are a dictatorship, right? And so, just like the other Polity 4 index, most political scientists crunch it into a tripartite variable, where you have from a 1 to a 2.5 is a democracy, from a 3 to a 5.5 is a mixed, or an anocracy, as they call it in Polity 4, and then from a 5.5 to a 7, you're a dictatorship. Okay, I want to add a fourth one that was created by one of my professors at Texas Tech University called the UDI. It is a growing and more often used indicator. And what they do is they take like 12 to 20 measures of democracy, depending on which year and which countries are available in whatever data set it is. They squish all of them together and they create an index for every nation in every annual indicator. And this was created by, among others, Dr. Mezer from Texas Tech University. And the sort of, man, what will we even call it? The diagnostic testing on these are really great because it does take all of those other measures into account. And so it gives you a really sort of indicative and highly nuanced measurement to use. So it's a pretty cool thing called the UDI. One thing I did want to bring up for Freedom House and for Polity 4, right, is their complexity. Um, they're taking a whole bunch of different things, squishing them into a single measurement that is supposed to score democracy versus autocracy. But when you're talking about Freedom House, right? Like what is it we're talking about? If say a democracy shows that we have a higher correlation between democracy and economic growth, right? What is it about the Freedom House Index or the Polity 4 Index that is pushing that correlation? Is it elections? Is it corruption? Is it government functionality? Is it free media? Like there are so many things in here that you have no damn idea what is going on inside of those numbers. And so that's really problematic with a DD index where it's just a 1 or a 0. You just got to follow these 4 rules. Makes it much simpler to understand what's going on and to really truly understand the causality, right? Where we're trying to pull causality out of the Freedom House Index is a mess, right? So something to think about. Okay, I would also point to map 5.1. I'm not really sure what page it is, but it was a really cool visual of what these 3 different um, democracy scores look like across the world, right? So if you look at the DD index, democracy dictatorship, where it's just a 1 and a 0, the vast majority of Asia and of Africa are dictatorships, right? Whereas if you move to Polity 4, they're a little more forgiving of Africa and Russia and some of the Eastern Europe bloc and Bangladesh and Pakistan and all of these places, right? Whereas Zavorsky, Shabub, and Lamanji are like, no, they just don't count. They don't meet those simple 4 qualifications. Whereas Polity 4 is a little more squishy about it. Like they're not a dictatorship, but they're not a democracy either, right? And then you get down to Freedom House, and Freedom House looks a little bit more like the DD indicator. It is a little bit more forgiving of, again, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Mozambique, and some of the sort of Eastern Bloc countries and the Horn of Africa. But they're less forgiving than Polity, right? And so there are major differences in these. And one of the major problems is that, like, yes, it's really obvious to say China is not a democracy and Canada is a democracy. But what about Botswana or South Africa or, India or Bangladesh or these middling countries or, Egypt? Those are much, much harder, and those are where you get the major disagreements in these indicators. Okay, we should also talk about how do we evaluate these measures, right? So there are 4 main evaluations that come from creating scientific measures. And most of these come from King of Harvard University. King and Keohane, I think, is his research partner. They do a crap load of work on social statistics. And so they came up with, from also former papers and stuff, but King mostly is the biggest proponent of this. And he says there's 4 real evaluations that we have to consider when seeing if a measurement, a piece of data, is worthy or not. And the first is conceptualization, right? And so we've talked a lot about this. Like, is it a minimalist or a maximalist conceptualization? So the dictatorship democracy, the DD index, very minimalist, right? Dichotomous variable, there's only 4 rules, whereas Freedom House would be like a maximalist, right? There's 80 questions they're asking about every single country. Who the hell knows what's driving the scores? And so there are concerns about causality and really understanding what it is in those scores that are driving correlative results. The second is validity, right? And this refers to the extent to which measures correspond to the concepts that they're intended to measure, right? So conceptually, we're trying to measure democracy versus dictatorship. And there's 3 real subclasses of validity. So we have the attributes of what we're trying to measure. Again, difficult arguments are to be made between the minimalist and maximist perspectives of what counts as democracy, right? Freedom House would say the DD index is way too minimalist. It doesn't tell us anything about the gradation of democracy. Whereas the DD people would say, look, we don't care about the gradation of democracy. We want a pure score that we know exactly what it means. So there are just arguments on both sides. The second problem is the aggregation problem, right? So this is not really a problem for the DD index, but it is a major problem for Polity 4 and especially Freedom House. How do you turn 80 indicators into a single score, and what the hell does that mean, right? There are so many ways to get a middling score that we really can't differentiate what's going on inside of those numbers. And then another problem is they have all of these weights and surveys and translation problems across countries, and what do these exact words mean? They have expert opinions of each country, so like it's a mess, right? And I'm not saying it's a bad measurement. I'm just saying like we don't really know what's happening inside of it. There's also the measurement level, right? So we have nominal, ordinal, and interval measurements. Nominal means it's just a category. Like we can't compare these things. Like right, we're comparing green versus red. Green is not more than red or twice as much as red. It doesn't really mean anything like that. We just want to know, is a democracy versus a dictatorship different when we run the results? Then we have ordinal measures. These are rank order, right? So consider something like, education level is a great one, right? So we have dropout, high school, I don't know, some college, associates, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And so while you can't say that like a master's degree is twice as much as a bachelor's degree, or that it's 3 times as much as a high school degree or whatever, you can say that you can like put these in order from lowest to highest, right? And then the final one is the interval measure that we're all pretty familiar with, right? This is money, this is weight, this is the speed of an object. Literally 100 miles an hour is double 50 miles an hour, right? $1,000 is half of $2,000. Like we can make those numerical relations. And so you got to remember there's these 3 different measures, right? So the nominal measure would be like the DD, and then the interval measure, arguably this is what they say. The interval measure is going to be more like Freedom House. I would be very careful about that and just use the ordinal rankings like most of them do, where you just go democracy, anocracy, dictatorship. We're not saying one is twice as much as the other, but we can sort of rank them, right? Okay. The third, what are we calling these? Evaluation of a measurement is reliability, right? Can it be repeatedly and consistently produce the same score for a given case when we apply the same measurement criteria? So, like, if I'm an expert weighing in on whether Ghana is a democracy or not, I should have a set of criteria on which I make that measurement, and then I should be able to give that set of criteria to 10 other experts, and they should be able to come up with the same exact sort of measurement that I do, right? Ghana is not a democracy. It scores a 2 or whatever it is on this thing. Um, and so what happens is usually what they do is they'll take a group of graduate students or other professionals. They will score any, like, if you're a Latin American expert, they'll put you on the Latin American countries. If you're a post-Soviet expert, they'll put you on the Eastern Bloc in Russia. Um, and they'll have all of those people grade, and then they'll compare the scores. And then what happens is they'll either index them or they'll average them, or the good ones, what they'll do is they'll take all the ones where everyone agrees and they'll use those numbers, and then they'll sort of man, what would you even call it? Like focus group the ones where there's disagreements to come to a better understanding about where that number should be, right? So yeah, interesting different ways to measure. And then the final one is replicability. This is very similar to the above. And this is just the idea that a third party scientist could replicate your exact results. So when you publish a paper, basically, you should have instructions on where did you get your data, what data transformations did you use, what was your model, and what diagnostics were used. So that any other scientist on the planet who is a political scientist can go and download your data, follow your instructions, and come up with the exact same numbers that you did, right? Unfortunately, this is incredibly rare. Um, the method sections are confusing in many scientific papers. The data can often be withheld because people don't want to share it because they put a lot of work into it. Um, Scientists generally don't get published just replicating data. So this is a problem, which we need more of. And that's one of the main points of the book by King and Kahane, was that we need a lot more replicability and reliability. Okay, that was a lot, and it was a lot of methods, but I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions, please just post them on the chat or email me or whatever you got. Have a great day, and I'll see you for the next one.